Create a 3D design from a generative outcome. In this video, we'll create a 3D design from a generative outcome. In Fusion 360, we want to carry on with our generative design geometry setup, and we want to make sure that we're inside of the Explore workspace. We need to identify the outcome that we want to use for our design, and in this case, I'm going to be taking the recommended Study 1, Outcome 1, and you can see that I have a star putting it in my favorites. This is the outcome that I want to use. Once I've chosen the outcome that I want to export as a design, I also need to pick the iteration. Now in this case, we've already filtered through various iterations, and the last one here, number 49, is going to work, but it's always a good idea to go back. If you're going to be using this as a basis for a future design, or if you're going to carry on manipulating the 3D geometry you get from generative design, you want to make sure that you do explore several of the iterations, because in some cases, the geometry might be more complete or cleaner. And what I mean by that is if we take a look at this back section here, we have these small openings, how they blend into what we're going to call the shock tower. And if we move back a little bit, we can take a look at that same area and we can see how those different areas are progressing with the design. And oftentimes, you can see that now we have just a single opening. And if we go back far enough, there might not be any openings at all. This can often be an easier piece of geometry to manipulate with the forms tools. So if the frames are very similar, a little bit further back in the design, but there are things like this where openings are closed off or certain geometry is just a little bit cleaner, there's no problem with using one of those earlier iterations. It's always a good idea to double check things like the displacement and the factor of safety, as well as the mass, to make sure that those are all within the range that's acceptable for you. And as mentioned, you can see that we've got this sharp section here where we're starting to go around an obstacle that we created. And these are things that are problematic that are going to have to be fixed, but we're going to take care of that downstream. So once I have identified the design, I can determine whether or not I want to create a 3D design from it, or if I want to create a mesh. Now, it's important to note that these processes might not always work. The mesh will generally be pretty robust and work because we're looking at the mesh on the screen. But by selecting that design option, what we're actually going to be asking Fusion 360 to do is replicate the generative geometry using a form body. This means that we're going to have loads of different faces, edges, and vertices that we can manipulate using our forms tools. And in some cases, when we have those small openings that are just beginning to form as the iterations progress, they can be problematic for creating that form geometry. But in a lot of cases, we can get a nice clean piece of geometry that we can work with using those form tools. This process to create the 3D design can often take a little bit of time, and once it's complete, we'll be able to click on the button inside of Explore and be able to export that directly into a 3D design. So I'm going to let this crank for just a little bit and we'll check back in as soon as it's ready to open. Now that the design is complete, we can select Design Ready, click to continue. We can open the design in Fusion 360 and take a look at the results. The first thing that we're going to notice is that we have a frame and we have some features in the timeline. Before we do anything, let's make sure that we do save this, and we're going to call this our generative frame outcome 1. This is something that we will dive deeper into and begin manipulating it with the forms tools. But if you weren't able to follow along and convert your own, you'll be able to use this in the next video by uploading the supplied dataset. So from here, if you did follow along, make sure that you do save your design before moving on.